Hi, I'm Kate Wagner of McMansion Hell, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Every now and then we run into A students who have become so accomplished in the multiple worlds of art, architecture, preservation, business, and common sense that it's a shame not to share those conversations with you. Joining us today is Christy MacLear, a very accomplished woman. She is the founder of Artist Ventures and has been CEO, past and present, of multiple organizations, including Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. And now, the flag bearer for the B students, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. I do wish I had done a little better in school.
Yeah, me too.
A solid B student, there were just too many activities to pursue in college. At that time, way back, me and my college pal Fred Flintstone would stay up all night playing Colossal Cave on the mainframe at UNC Chapel Hill. It was a password-protected game that only the grad students were supposed to know about. Theoretically, you could get in trouble for playing without authorization, but that never happened, or we would be in mainframe jail for life. That, plus the password, was an open secret. AOEFCCI, I believe it was. Just 7 characters.
How many of your passwords can you name? That you take one from how long ago?
This much heralded computer science department, in an era way before the internet, just used this password for about everything.
Oh, no.
Even on the printouts, easily accessible by anyone walking by, had AOEFCCI right there, not even obscured with asterisks. It was a different time. Fred and I discovered this password and mapped our way through this completely text-based Colossal Cave game with no graphics whatsoever, into the night, each room and magic spell and sequence of commands. And it took us months to make it all the way through. At the time, there were maybe half a dozen mainframe games you could play, including a basic but not so interesting Star Trek text game. Colossal Cave was the top gun, though, inspiring Zork and Carmen Sandiego and thousands more computer games. With the addition of graphics, Colossal Cave was the forerunner to Doom and much later, Fortnite. Looking back, Fred and I should have been studying or working out or sleeping, but I still fire up Colossal Cave every year.
What, on your mainframe?
On my PC, and you can too. Just look up Colossal Cave on Google Play. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. At first glance, my guest, Christy MacLear, is such an underachiever. I mean, she only graduated from a little safety school called Stanford. How slack is that? And then there was a Harvard MBA. They're everywhere. But then Stanford put her on their board of trustees. Everyone does that, right? Well, no, they don't. And her other accomplishments are pretty stunning. She's been CEO for Superblue, a thrilling, immersive experience in Miami, which you should put on your travel list, Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and at Philip Johnson's Glass House. She's been vice chairman at Sotheby's and consulted for the Cleveland Clinic, Disney, and one of my favorites, the fabulously mid-century modern Noyes House in New Canaan, Connecticut. She's the founder of the consulting firm Artist Ventures, a podcast producer. She's into stuff like Web3 and NFTs and blockchain and AI and anything cutting edge. In her spare time, which she obviously has a lot of, she's been on Stanford's Arts Council, Stanford's Cantor Museum, and she's chair of New York City's Municipal Art Society. These are just the high points. There's much more at ChristyMacLear.com, like her time at one of my favorite museums, the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. Over the course of 3 decades, she's influenced the nonprofit world and continues to do so through teaching at the University of Texas at Austin, which you'll recall from past shows, that's where the country's first 3D printed neighborhood just got built, designed by Bjarke Ingels. Welcome, Christy.
Hi, you're making me blush.
It's really impressive. Wow.
I'm tired. Thanks for that introduction. That's very nice. I should actually talk about how amazing you are and what you've done for our profession.
Oh, I'll have to
you.
be a guest on your podcast. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you on the show, and I have to ask because of your deep tech knowledge. When you get paid by clients, do you prefer Bitcoin or cash?
Right now I take cash, which, I did actually take cryptocurrency because I'm sort of a believer in cryptocurrency.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I just tell people it's kind of like the euro. If you don't like it, you can cash it out, right?
Yeah, what I loved about it, I actually liked the philosophy behind it. So I think, when you were taking cryptocurrency as a method of payment, you had to assume that you were a part of a brand new economy, and who knew what value that was going to derive. So It was a bit of a risk assessment, but, it's about decentralized control. That really appeals to me.
But isn't that like the beginning of everything? Like the internet that Al Gore invented? I mean, that was supposed to be decentralized control too, right?
It's so funny. I mean, your question is a great one. It's about adoption. And I'll tell you a little funny story. So my first job out of business school was at the Walt Disney Company. We were building this new town called Celebration.
Oh, yeah. Not known for its modernist designs, by the way.
Well, that was the first time I met Philip Johnson. He was one of the head of they called it the big eight, all the architects. And the funny thing was, so this was in the early 90s, AOL had just started. And of course, this is a fiber optically connected community. So it's a little bit like Sidewalk Labs, but like 30 years earlier. And, there were all sorts of crazy things like we said, well, what would a newspaper look like in a new town with a fiber optic backbone? And we said, well, let's go talk to Knight Ridder down in Miami. Maybe they'll have some idea. And they basically said, there's a guy in the basement. His name is Roger Fiedler. He's got this crazy idea about a pad. And then, it's like a tablet and people can go and they can look at the newspaper, and we may cut the whole division because we really just don't think it's going to be adopted.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like in the early 90s, had Roger Fiedler, had a lunch with Steve Jobs, then the whole world would have been, at the digital newspaper and podcasts so much earlier. So I don't know. I think adoption is like, when you're pioneering a space, you should just assume the vicissitudes of that.
Right. I remember way back when the IBM PC was the cutting edge thing.
Yeah.
And they were telling us like how many more vacation days we were going to have each year from all the time we were going to be saving from using this new personal computer.
Right. That's really funny. When I went to college, I think Apple Computer had just come out with sort of the portable Apple, and we, pulled it out of the box, and, it was a single-sided disk. And anyway, I do think, now you look at things like, the metaverse and how people can experience architecture digitally. And there's so many ways in which our world, it's really just about accepting these radical new ideas. And I think the disciplines of architecture and design and artists, they're front runners. They'll always adopt early, which sort of pulls the general public into that sort of next wave.
Yeah, there's some sort of set of stages, right? Like in the beginning, they think you're crazy, and then you're onto something when they attack you. Is that how that goes? I remember there's some sort of...
There must be some great New Yorker cartoon about it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
My nickname at Disney was the Fog Sculptor, and I think it pretty much, if you're talking about, the evolution of a career, it's really about sort of defining the path of the future or helping put some architecture around ideas. And I don't design things per se, but I have built businesses around things. And I think resistance is something that is always the first lump is, there are believers and there are pioneers. How you build an industry, how you build adoption is it's a longer term prospect, and it takes years and patience to do that.
In my previous consulting world, we used to call that the crystallizer role.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The fog sculptor
Yeah.
is the crystallizer role.
Yeah.
I like that. There should be a whole group of young people who have that role, I think.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the young people are so creative these days. I think they're, especially with Zoom and COVID and how we are working these days, I'm sure that there are going to be much less rigorous processes and expectations, and there may be more crystallizers in the world.
I hope so. We need more of those. We really do.
I know. I agree.
You have kind of a unique output from your business, and the best way that I can describe it is that you are helping individuals and organizations sculpt their legacy, how they're going to be remembered, which is a very unique niche.
It is. It's sort of prospective. It's like future oriented and past oriented. When I started at the Philip Johnson Glass House, part of the challenge was how did we capture and describe the legacy of Philip Johnson? And how did we also change the business model for the Historic House Museum, which is sort of a failing model. I call it the single visit, business model, which will never work. And same thing with Robert Rauschenberg. When you start an artist foundation, you have to really imagine what is the legacy that you're capturing for the artist, but also giving it legs so that it's not retrospective all the time. It's evaluated by values. One of the things I always talk to artists about is what are the driving values that you want your legacy to be defined by? It always helped. So when we said something like, if Robert Rauschenberg was going to open a museum, what would that look like? It would be collaborative, it would be alternative, it would use different materials. So, we actually looked at it like, it probably wouldn't just be a place where his artwork was shown. It would be something where maybe there could be dance performances, or maybe there was a way that people could interact with the work through archival or what we were giving to the museum. So I do think that process of building a legacy is about looking back at the person's driving values and thinking about all of the opportunities going forward. And that's sort of your rubric, so to say.
What are some of the more successful organizations built around an individual that you have worked with that have been able to make that leap from the retrospective perspective to this whole new environment that includes that but moves on?
I'll tell you, I was really impressed by some of the work that Julia Gruen was doing at the Keith Haring Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you why. It was, Keith Haring was an artist who was really invested in the AIDS movement and in sort of how public works could shape public perception. And I think that a lot of the foundation invested in projects that took very contemporary issues and took that historic lens and really moved it forward. So it wasn't as if they could only go back and sponsor AIDS-related initiatives, but it was really about broader people's access to healthcare, issues about diverse rights. It was an interest in sort of radical thinking about ways in which people access art. So it wasn't just about how did Keith Haring actually exhibit his art, but it was entirely new things. So they were some of the early pioneers into the NFT space. Really amazing. And, they sponsored condom distribution nationally. So it's sort of like they were really fun. They were high risk takers. They did stuff that was not safe. It was sort of unexpected. And I think that also is like his art in many ways, sort of has a sense of humor about it.
Yeah.
So that's one that most people might not know about or think about is Keith Haring. And so I admire what the foundation did and what Julia did in her leadership there. I had a chance to work with Eric Fischel and April Gornick to purchase a historic church in Sag Harbor. And that was working with a living artist, which is different because asking an artist who's living about what their legacy is, nobody wants to think about their posthumous, image. or their death per se. But Eric and April were so inspiring, and it really was about that community. And in many ways, their name isn't even on it's called The Church, but it was about putting the artist as the leader in the programming seat. So that programming that happens in this historic church that's been radically altered in this amazing way and preserved is led by artists, Laurie Anderson to G.E. Smith. It's a really amazing slate of programs that I just think is something that everybody should go visit and see, is the church in Sag Harbor. So those are two great examples. I hope that people just check those out.
There are many people who are famous, of course, but there are a lot of non-famous people who I know are thinking about their particular legacy as it involves their house. And have a mid-century modernist house somewhere designed by a well-known architect, probably built in the 40s, 50s, or 60s. They're probably the second or third owner. They know the house is important, but they don't know really what to do, if their kids are going to want it, how to value it, what to do.
Yeah.
You have advised some various people on that, including our good friend Fred Noyes of the Noyes House in New Canaan.
I know, which is a remarkable home.
It really is. Designed by his dad, Elliot Noyes.
Yeah.
What is that? Is it bicameral, binormal? It's by something, where you have two separate wings of a house, the residential side and the living side.
And an outdoor hallway.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not normal.
So if you want to go to breakfast in the winter, you have to just kind of run from one side to the other through the outdoor courtyard.
Yeah. That's exactly right. You know, that house is such a gem. And in many ways, Fred has always said, you know, the glass house is a national treasure. And he believes, and I think rightly so, that the Noyes House is also a national treasure.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that's really important is that house is more than that house. That house was the center of that family. And therefore, it's really emblematic of the thought that Elliot Noyes represents, which is design thinking and leadership in our country. And I think what it really represents is the fact that Elliot Noyes introduced not just sort of the origin of the Aspen Ideas Festival, you know, which in that case was the design festival, but it really was about how did CEOs of Fortune, any company, Fortune, let's say 100, but let's say it's every company, should be using design thinking to really have a consumer's view and to use design as a way to enhance how our living is. It's enhanced, it's improved through design. So, you know, it's not as if it's more like an Olivetti typewriter versus a standard operating engineered designed typewriter. So, you know, I think of that house as a center point for that broader leadership conversation. Okay. And that's what makes that house so important, really.
So is that a general formula for anybody that has a house by a special architect, is to try to find the bigger message to carry forward?
Well, if you are going to preserve the house and open it, let's imagine that you get in touch with your local preservation council. So that might be a state preservation council, it might be a regional. And if it's of global significance or national significance, let's imagine the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Putting a house on the register is one of the most important things you can do. And that's just an easement, which I think is part of what everybody should do who thinks their house is significant, to preserve a house. So you put an easement on the house, it gives you a tax incentive. It radically alters what your tax payment is, but it may also alter what the ultimate value is, but it preserves the home and it can't be torn down. So that to me is the first thing anybody should do in order to make it part of an architecture, like a canon. It's a part of a broader conversation for our country. And then if you're thinking about, when you do that, you're really supposed to invite people into your house, let's say 1 or 2 days a year. And that narrative your question is really about narrative. What's the story of the house? And it's not just about the architect. It's about What was the architect thinking when they designed the home? Did they live in the home? What was their philosophy? Was it designed with that philosophy in mind? I'm a big lover of the 70s. I was a young girl in the 70s. And I think that I am a little concerned that things from the 70s will get torn down because brutalist architecture isn't sort of a warm and embraceable sort of architectural style.
And it has enemies now, too. It has a whole group of people who hate it.
I'm sure. Well, yeah. I mean, even its name sort of connotes a brutalist. I think it's such a great name because it calls forward all sorts of feelings. Anyway, I do think that having architectural representation across all of our decades in our country is really important. So people see, what an open living style was like, what the new materials that were being introduced. Paul Rudolph had a lot of houses in Connecticut that were being torn down. And it was one of the reasons we did a survey in New Canaan of about 120 homes to start to develop the nomenclature for the field cards.
And that was in 2009, because I have a copy of that report.
You do?
I do. Absolutely.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I just want to thank all of those homeowners who participated in that because, up to that point, field cards sort of stopped at the Victorian era, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you define what's significant for a judge if that nomenclature isn't even included in what's significant or not? So I think that, the New Canaan modern homeowners did a great service for everybody in that way.
Well, New Canaan is a great example of something that goes on in a lot of towns around the country, particularly the smaller towns, not the cities so much. Mm-hmm. And that is that the first modernist house comes along. It's kind of an innovator, like we were talking earlier, and people just ignore it. And then the second or third house comes along, and they ignore it. And then 4 through 10 come rolling into town, and all of a sudden it's like people are like, oh my God, we're being invaded by these houses. And New Canaan, evidently, from what I can tell, has never really warmed to these things, even though there are 60 or 70 of them, 100 of them, 150 of them now, with new ones being built all the time.
Right.
There's still resistance to this kind of architecture 70 years later. How come?
Well, it's funny. There was and I believe it was actually in the New Yorker, there was like a parody of the two sides of New Canaan, the gray flannel suit movie side of New Canaan,
Uh-huh.
The 1940s, it's a sibling of Greenwich kind of New Canaan. And then there's like the modernists, the people who went to New Canaan because there weren't building codes. Some of the things that are built in New Canaan, you couldn't even build now. There's a house that spans a river. There were houses that used alternative materials. So, Breuer was there and Johnson was there and Noyes was there. And, it's called the Harvard Five. And so I think it's actually really funny and what has resulted is New Canaan is a place that has a lot of creative people. Whether it's Lorne Michaels or Paul Simon or Gene Wilder lived there. Like, it was a crazy, really both conservative community and a really modern, advanced, like crazy creative community. And everybody loved that. And I think that sort of complexity is what made the community so wonderful. I don't think of it as a war as much as a warm embrace of two radical thinkers.
Well, I mean, that's great. And it really does work out like that day by day. But I know New Canaan, for instance, with the Glass House, it doesn't see it as kind of this cultural center we want to get more and more people to come to because then they will add to our economy and stay in our hotels and work with our restaurants. There are actually significant restrictions on what this 50-acre property can do, which to me seems kind of strange for a property that large and as significant as Philip Johnson's Glass House. How did you deal with that when you were director there?
Well, so I was the first director, and we worked with the town to define those regulations. And I agree with you. The regulations are actually much less traffic-wise for the surrounding neighbors than if you had 50 one-acre parcels and the traffic that would be derived from 50 families with 3 cars each. So imagine the traffic in that scenario.
Yeah.
However, the counterbalancing consideration was, what is an experience on the house supposed to be like? You really don't want to go into the glass house with more than 10 people. It's a place that you want to have an intimate experience. When you're in the house, it's about being surrounded by nature, not being surrounded by people. So in reality, I think that there's a nice balance struck between the perfect experience on the glass house site and the consideration of the neighbors. And I also think that anybody who's opening a house, this is a long-term gig. You've got to consider when you're going to open a house, historic, once a year or every day of the year, you've got to imagine that you're going to steward this house for 50 years, 100 years, and what it's going to take financially to do that and what the systems are to put into place for that. And I also am a big believer in piloting things, I'll have to say, so before you do the 100-year plan, I think that you can try and see what it's like, like for the Noyes House, for example, we've had a discussion about, does it need to be an ongoing tour, or could it just be a place where CEO and design conversations happen, which is a continuation of the legacy? A little different. It's not that people can't privately schedule, once or twice a month, but really the origin of the importance of that house necessitates a different programming model. So that's a little bit of a strategic question you have to ask. And it's not every place has to be toured.
It's a good question. What are some places that are important but aren't tourable?
Oh, that's really a good question. I mean, let me turn that around for you, which is, here's a place that's tourable, but really difficult to get to, which is the Farnsworth House. Okay. Farnsworth House, Mies van der Rohe, so significant, amazing. It's like an opera. You go there and you hear angels sing.
Right.
It's so beautiful.
As you swim over to the house if it floods.
Totally. And with climate change, God bless, I can't even imagine. I think that the Farnsworth House is a classic example of, it's waiting for people to tour it, but it's so far outside of Chicago, and it's actually it's not surrounded by anything. And so in a way, there's a case of it's accessible, but nobody gets there. And that's sort of a sad, fact. It would be almost better for the Farnsworth House to have a different programming model, where its use case is a little different,
Well, they're going to jack it up on hydraulic piers, right? Isn't that the plan? So they can just elevate the house when the river floods?
I don't know the exact plan, but I do know that several of the directors there had spoken to Dutch architects and engineers, because
right.
Of course.
Important point. If you want to go for the best, go for the Dutch. I tell you, they're
everywhere.
They're
always the best. Yes, we love the Dutch. Exactly. The Swiss, Yves Bahar, we love you too. Yeah, we're not forgetting the Swiss. And, of course, then there's the Venetians. I mean, the Venetians have a similar situation, right? So I'm sure that we need to talk to them, because Venice is sort of in a similar,
They
situation.
built those giant seawalls in the canals to try to keep the water level from going up.
Right.
I'm not sure how that's working out yet, but it was a very expensive project.
Yeah, I think all of these are very expensive projects. I know that there was also a conversation about moving it. There's a whole, can you move the Farnsworth House kind of conversation? And I think when you're in the hypothetical state, you put all the balls on the table, But for your audience, I think, if anybody's in Chicago or going to Chicago, it's going to take a day, but you should go out and see the Farnsworth House, because it is really a remarkable place.
Plano, Illinois, about an hour to the west of Chicago. There are tour operators that will take you as well. If you don't have a car, you can just hop on their little minibus and they go out there for the day. And it is really well worth it. I've been there a couple times, and it's fantastic. And, one day if they put these hydraulic things in, you'll be able to see it by boat as it stands 5 feet over the flooding water of the Fox River, which will be, that'll be, one of those viral videos of watching the house ascend into the sky.
Yeah. I think there's also questions like, how can you be a steward for a house, right? I mean, I'm actually in the process of moving back to Chicago. And I am a person, I'm like the perfect candidate to buy a house or an apartment or a townhouse that needs sort of a steward. So I will say this for our listening audience, which is there are houses out there that, for example, I knew of a house outside of Chicago, which was the glass modernist structure that was in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Do you remember where the Ferrari?
Oh, James Spire. We interviewed those owners on the show a couple of years ago.
There you go. Well, that house was for sale. And I remember that when I lived in Chicago about 20 years ago, I was like, that's amazing. Oh my God, that house needs a steward. Like that, some steward has to buy that house. I wish for more agents. Like there's somebody called the creative agent.
Yes.
And he identifies houses all around the country that need stewards, and that creative people would want to buy an Edward Durrell Stone house or a Noyes House where you have to put your slippers on to go from the dining room to the bathroom. Or
right.
Do you see what I'm saying? Like there is a need for more of that. And I think everybody should have a little adventure where they live, right? They should sort of live in a place that has some character.
So which house are you going to pick?
I don't know.
Christy in Chicago to be the steward of.
Anybody who's listening to this right now should contact me right away if you have an amazing place that I should steward and invest in. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some really nice ones there on the north side of town as well, along the lake area.
Mm-hmm.
And, they don't come up for sale as often as some other areas of the country, but they do.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go there. I'll have a little soft landing, and then I'll just wait for the right thing to come up. I think that's also sort of part of being a steward is the patience factor that is required to be a steward, right?
Right.
So, yeah. So I'll be sort of at the ready, and, when the right place comes along that needs somebody to take care of it, then I'll be ready for that.
And for all of you out there who have a house like this you want to take care of, remember what Christy said about getting your house on the National Register of Historic Places, which is just a designation. And then secondly, and most importantly, getting a preservation easement on the house, which is like a homeowners association for one. It's like Campbell's Soup for one. It just applies to your house, and you can make it as loose or as tight as you want, depending on how you work it out with your local preservation organization.
Yep.
But that, in most jurisdictions, is the only legally enforceable way to protect how a house looks and how it functions often in the future. Anything else is usually just a delay in demolition, 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year in certain places, but you can't stop it without a preservation easement.
Right.
So, Christy, thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been delightful.
Oh, you are such a treasure. Thank you for what you do. And I wanted to you and I were speaking earlier about how you've sort of digitized and created links for all of the architectural books and magazines, and that's a great service. And I just want to thank you for doing that.
George was talking with the extraordinary Christy MacLear.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Los Angeles, Malibu, Palm Springs, and Toronto. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guilde. You are in a maze of twisty little passages all alike. When you play Colossal Cave, you're gonna see this phrase a lot. Hope you're mapping as you go. George and I'll be back soon with another B-Student edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
The magic word is XYZZY.
Oh, I remember that.